In this video, we briefly review the protocol for the driving pressure limited ventilation group of the IMV domain on the practical platform. In the driving pressure limited ventilation group, the patient can be placed in any volume cycled or pressure targeted mode of ventilation, including pressure control, volume control, and pressure support. This ventilation strategy targets driving pressure. We use different measurements to monitor driving pressure depending on whether the patient is passively ventilated or breathing during ventilation. When the patient is in controlled ventilation without respiratory efforts, the plateau pressure, driving pressure, P-OC, and PEEP must be measured with each routine ventilation rounds. If the patient is not breathing, the P-OC will be 0. Note that during controlled ventilation, if the expiratory occlusion to measure P-OC is prolonged for several seconds, the patient may begin to make a delayed effort. In this situation, the P-OC is still 0, but it indicates that the patient may be ready to transition to assisted ventilation. When the patient is in assisted ventilation, we monitor the lung distending pressure by measuring peak airway pressure, P-OC, and PEEP at each routine ventilation assessment. Let's briefly review the ventilation targets in the driving pressure limited group. During passive ventilation, the driving pressure must be kept less than or equal to 15 centimeters of water, the plateau pressure less than or equal to 35 centimeters of water, the pH above 7.15, and the respiratory rate less than 40 breaths per minute. During assisted ventilation, when the patient is breathing, we use a different target to reflect the combined effects of the ventilator and the patient effort on the pressure applied to the lung. In this case, the dynamic transpulmonary driving pressure must be less than or equal to 23 centimeters of water. The other measurement targets include a pH above 7.15 and a respiratory rate less than or equal to 40 breaths per minute. You can use the online protocol app to help guide you through the protocol to make sure that the patient is on target. The app can be accessed on your mobile device using the QR code on the bedside protocol reference card. To access the app via the platform website, go to www.practicalplatform.org, click on the Resource tab, and then subsequently select the Decision Support tool. Here we see an example of a screenshot from the app where the patient is in passive ventilation and not on target. Once the ventilator settings and measurements are entered, the app will calculate the driving pressure, then state if the patient is on target or suggest any changes if required. In this case, the driving pressure is found to be excessive during passive ventilation, and the app lists the appropriate actions in response. These include adjusting PEEP to see if lung compliance can be improved to reduce driving pressure at the current tidal volume, and adjusting the tidal volume or inspiratory pressure to ensure that the driving pressure is on target, if the pH permits. The respiratory rate may be increased to a maximum of 40 breaths per minute to maintain the pH on target. After adjustments are made, the measurements can be repeated and re-entered in the app to ensure the protocol is being followed. In this scenario, the patient is in assisted ventilation, breathing spontaneously and not on target. Once the ventilator settings and measurements are entered, the app will calculate the dynamic transpulmonary driving pressure, then state if the patient is on target or suggest any changes if required. In this case, the lung distending pressure is found to be excessive during assisted ventilation, and the app lists the appropriate actions in response. These include adjusting PEEP to see if lung compliance can be improved and reduce respiratory effort, decreasing the tidal volume or inspiratory pressure as the pH target permits, or increasing the respiratory rate to a maximum of 40 breaths per minute to achieve the target pH. If these interventions don't work, you can also try temporarily increasing the FiO2 by 20% as a trial to see if respiratory effort decreases. Finally, sedation can be increased if needed to reduce effort to achieve the targets. If absolutely necessary, sedation to apnea is permitted to control excessive respiratory effort. After adjustments are made, the measurements can be repeated and re-entered in the app to ensure that the protocol is being followed. Once the patient recovers from respiratory failure, the intervention can be discontinued. The criteria for discontinuing the intervention are as follows. The patient should be triggering the ventilator continuously. The FiO2 must be less than or equal to 40%. The PEEP must be less than or equal to 8 centimeters of water. The saturation greater or equal to 90%, and the inspiratory pressure, which is computed as the peak pressure minus the PEEP, has to be less than or equal to 10 centimeters of water. If the ventilator settings increase for more than 2 hours, the patient goes back on the intervention. This continues for up to day 28 after randomization. If a patient is extubated and then re-intubated before day 28, the ventilation strategy still applies until day 28.